It's time to fix election integrity in America. Election fraud is very real, and it takes on many different forms. It doesn't have to be rampant in order to be significant. Elections have been won and lost on the basis of a single vote. In the era of big data, election operatives have become very skilled in what's referred to as micro-targeting of key voting blocks. In this podcast, we will explore election integrity in detail and identify the best solutions to these challenges. Enough with the fake news, enough with the political agendas. Let's fix election integrity.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Yes, Houston, we've had a problem.
We have a lot to unpack on this topic of election integrity. Let's start by identifying the current problems we have with election integrity. And let's break these problems into two basic areas. Number one, process subversion, i.e. the act of messing with the act of voting or the tallying of the votes. And number two, influence operations, shaping the attitudes and actions of voters prior to voting. Now, regarding process subversion, we need to start by recognizing that the election process is much more complex than many people realize. This complexity makes it subject to subversion, many times without any way of detecting this subversion before or after it has occurred. Modern voting machines may simplify a lot of different user tasks, but behind that friendly little user interface lies a complex network of inputs and outputs that can be exploited by people with nefarious intent. Furthermore, the simple act of transferring the data from one computer to another or from a polling location to the clerk's office opens the door to security risks. Subversion of election processes takes on many forms. We will explore many of these vulnerabilities in this podcast. Now, in addition to process subversion, we also need to recognize the role that influence operations play in undermining free and fair elections. The term influence operations in this podcast has been applied in a much broader context than its military origins would suggest. In this context, influence operations are going to be treated as any activities designed to shift voter sentiment regarding a candidate for office or policy issue, essentially following that red line back and forth. We will look at a large number of ways election outcomes can be influenced via these activities. Now, some of these ways are perfectly legal, such as candidates appealing to voters for votes. Some of these ways are not exactly illegal, but they are indeed suspect in the court of public opinion, such as political bias or censorship in the media. And some of these ways, though, we need to recognize are outright attempts to undermine our system of government through the election process. All right, let's dig into this topic a little bit further with some background information that will help us evaluate potential solutions to our election integrity risks. We'll examine federal election law, how elections are administered, and what the election processes actually look like. Then, with this understanding firmly in hand, we're going to take a look at specific examples of process subversion and influence operations. First, let's take a look at current federal election law, as this is something we all have in common across all 50 states. The election of congressional representatives and senators is governed by Article 1, Section 4 of the United States Constitution. It delegates pretty much all responsibility except for the timing of general elections to the states, including the selection of U.S. senators at the time, which originally were selected by the state legislatures, not directly by the people. The founders designed it this way to keep the authority of the federal government in check and respectful of state authority. The adoption of the 17th Amendment changed that. United States senators are now elected via statewide vote of citizens at large. The bottom line is that federal elections and elections in general are by and large still regulated by the state, not federal government. All right, let's look at the election of the president and vice president. The election of the president and vice president is governed by Article 2, Section 1 of the United States Constitution, which introduces the concept of the Electoral College. Technically, the people do not elect the president and vice president. The people elect electors, which elect them. Much like the election of congressional representatives and U.S. senators, the election of electors is largely regulated by state governments. Most states assign all their electoral votes to the candidate with the largest number of votes statewide, but states do have some flexibility in this regard. All right, now when some states abuse their autonomy on election matters by infringing upon the voting rights of citizens on the basis of their race, color, or previous condition of servitude, Congress got involved and passed the 15th Amendment in 1869. It was later ratified by we the people a year later in 1870. The 15th Amendment opened the door to federal legislation to regulate election activities within states. Now, recent examples of such legislation by the federal government include the following laws. I'm going to provide links to each of these laws for your review in the notes for this podcast. Now, despite such federal laws, there still is significant variation between states on the regulation of elections. Michigan has something called an election officials manual that summarizes the implication of these laws in very, very practical terms. And I'm going to be providing a link to this manual as well in our release around the Solution podcast. The key actors in the administration of election across all 50 states is somewhat standard, although the terms used may actually vary quite a bit. Every state, though, has a chief election official, usually designated as the Secretary of State. Furthermore, each state also has an election board or state board of canvassers to decide upon specific election matters as delegated by state law. Local clerks are responsible for most of the heavy lifting during elections, as they are responsible for the secure execution of elections within their jurisdiction. The increasing prevalence of absentee ballots and mail-in voting initiatives has also made the United States Post Office a very key player in the execution of elections as well. And last but not least are the voters, who are ultimately responsible for exercising their civic duty and responsibility of voting. Secure elections require the successful execution of many distinct processes. The details of these processes may vary significantly from state to state, particularly around terminology, but there are some common threads across these processes that warrant further discussion. Now, I've broken all these processes down into 8 different topics, and it all starts with the voter registration process, which results in a statewide voter registration database that in Michigan we refer to as a qualified voter file. This voter registration database is a sum total of all citizens who are eligible to vote in an upcoming election. The next set of activities involves the tasks around the preparation for election day, such as printing ballots, configuring voting machines, and training poll workers. Now, the act of voting is an obvious process to evaluate. There are 2 distinct methods for voting, though. Traditionally, the most common method of voting is at the polls. But voters can also vote absentee, which involves mailing their ballot to the local clerk to be tabulated on election night. Absentee voting, particularly in the era of social distancing, is becoming increasingly popular. During the last election in Michigan, over 2/3 of the voters voted absentee. We examine each of these methods separately because the act of voting at the polls or via an absentee ballot features some important differences, particularly when it comes to verifying the identity of the actual voter. Okay, now once all the votes have been cast and the polls are closed, we need to address the all-important task of tallying the votes in a secure manner. All right, we also need to recognize that sometimes there are glitches in the election process. Stuff happens, machines break, ballots are spoiled, processes are not followed to the letter as they should. Now, when there are discrepancies, the reconciliation of these discrepancies is supposed to go through a disciplined reconciliation process in order to ensure the recording of each vote in a secure manner. Assuming that all goes well, there's also a distinct process for certifying elections, once the voting has been completed and the integrity of the voting artifacts have been verified. Now, if the election results are challenged, the challenge would initiate an election recount process as stipulated by state law. Now, the sum total of these election processes form the core of our election system in America. Not as simple as just simply casting a vote and counting the votes, is it? For your reference, at letsfixstuff.org website, I've created some fairly generic process flow diagrams for each of the topics that we discussed. And they're available to Right Stuff members for them to download and go off and analyze at their leisure. All right, now that we've reviewed all these election processes and we defined them, we now have the necessary background to start analyzing how these processes might be subverted, either intentionally or unintentionally. In engineering parlance, we have teed it up for a failure modes and effects analysis, and that's just what I did. I'm going to spare you all the long division and cut to the chase. As a result of this failure modes and effects analysis, I've identified the following artifacts as critical items. Each of these artifacts needs to be secured in order to ensure the security of our elections. If the integrity of any one of these artifacts is breached, it puts the election result at risk of not being fair and accurate. All right, why is the registered voter database important? Well, as we discussed earlier, it represents your ticket to the Super Bowl. No ticket, no entrance. In context of elections, if you're not in the voter database, you are not eligible to vote in most states. Furthermore, it contains all the critical information that a poll worker needs to verify that you are who you say you are. Which leads us to our next critical artifact, poll books. Poll books break down the statewide registered voter database into precinct-sized chunks. Precincts are the lowest common denominator of voting jurisdictions. When you register to vote, you are assigned a voting precinct which corresponds to a specific polling location where you go to vote should you vote in person. A single polling location may feature one or more precincts, but each precinct has its own poll book, and it can be in two formats. It can be a paper printout and a binder, or it could be on a laptop. Poll workers at each precinct use the data in each poll book to verify the identity of each voter. If someone tries to vote who's not in the poll book, the voter is supposed to be issued a provisional ballot, which leads us to our next critical artifact, provisional ballots. Provisional ballots are tracked separately from regular ballots. Provisional ballots are only supposed to be converted into regular ballots once the voter's identity has been verified. And they don't swap to get a different ballot. They just move it from a provisional envelope to put it in the voting machine and get voted. Now, these regular ballots are the lifeblood of elections. Voters cast their votes on ballots, so it kind of makes sense that the secure tracking of ballots is very important to the security of any election. Since thousands of people can vote in each election and each ballot contains dozens of voting decisions, we use voting machines to tabulate these votes for each precinct. Voting machines may make it simple for voters to vote, but they hide significant complexity behind their touchscreen interface. Some of the features common to all these voting machines, which you may not have considered before, are the following. Each of these voting machines need to have some means of initializing the vote count on that machine to ensure that it's starting at 0. It also needs to have some means of tabulating the vote. That kind of makes sense. It needs to have a means of correcting ballot feeds on the part of the poll worker or voting errors at the request of the voter. It also needs to have some means of sharing the votes with election officials, either through paper printout or some electronic means like a USB flash drive or some sort of a network connection. And then it also needs some means of securing the vote machine once the vote tally has been shared in the case of a recount. You need to have that that machine configuration nailed down before the election can be certified. Now, the purpose of these machines is to tally the vote. These vote tallies in turn become important control artifacts. Precinct vote tallies are shared with the local clerk and the county clerk. These precinct tallies are aggregated by these clerks and shared with the public and state election officials. The certification of each election is supposed to be subject to verifying the integrity of the precinct level control artifacts for pertinent election question. It's worth noting, though, I could have singled out mail as a control artifact as well, since absentee ballots are transferred from voters to clerks via the United States Postal Service, but the integrity of our mail system is well beyond the scope of this analysis. All right, one way of summarizing interrelation of all these artifacts is shown in this diagram. The voter database bone is connected to the poll book bone, which is connected to the ballot bone, either provisional or regular, absentee or poll-based. Eventually, all valid ballots end up being tabulated in a voting machine. Absentee ballots arrive or don't arrive via the United States Postal Service or ballot drop boxes in front of the clerk's office. These ballots are fed into the voting machine, which yields a precinct-level vote tally. This vote tally is sealed with other voting artifacts specific to each precinct and submitted to local and county election officials. The county election official then shares this information with state election officials. In the case of presidential election, the statewide results initiate designation of electors who then cast their votes for president and vice president. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? I believe you're going to find out that maintaining the integrity of our elections is anything but straightforward. Well, let's dig a little bit deeper into these key election artifacts now so that we can get a better understanding of where our security risks really lie. First, let's take a closer look at the ballot. Not a ballot with any votes on it. We want to secure that. Just a generic ballot before any vote has been cast. Now, each ballot, you can't see it necessarily up close here, but each ballot actually has a ballot number which ties each voter to a specific ballot. This ballot number is only written on a stub connected to the ballot. Before an individual casts a vote, this stub is separated from the ballot so that each individual vote is kept private. This is important to note because if a voter's identity has not been verified prior to separating the stub from the ballot, there's no way to do so after the stub has been torn away. That is why provisional ballots are supposed to be separated from regular ballots. Unfortunately, poor training or poor ethics can lead to provisional ballots being mixed in with regular ballots by some poll workers. Once the stub is separated from the ballot, it also complicates recount operations, especially when the number of ballots counted differs from the number of eligible voters as addressed in the poll book. Next, let's take a closer look at the difference between how absentee voter ballots are processed and poll voter ballots are processed using poll books. Remember, the purpose of poll books is to verify the eligibility of someone to vote, plus verify that the person voting is who they say they are. All right, let's start by looking at how absentee voters are verified. Picture ID is obviously problematic, so how do poll workers verify an absentee ballot was cast by the individual assigned to the ballot? Well, the first point of verification is whether or not the number on the ballot stub corresponds to the ballot number entered in the poll book when the ballot was sent out to the voter. Next, they verify that the ballot envelope was signed. At this point, the poll worker should also verify that the signature on the ballot envelope matches the signature in the poll book that was captured at the time of registration. Very few poll workers are certified handwriting recognition experts, however. Couple this observation with the fact that many students are no longer being taught to write in cursive, and we have significant election integrity vulnerability when it comes to absentee voter verification. Okay, how about verifying the identity of voters who cast their votes in person at polling locations? Voters are asked for their name, their address, their signature, and some form of ID, not always a picture ID. The name, address, and signature can be verified in poll book by poll book data. When it comes to identification, though, not all states have the same identification requirements. This chart here shows from the National Council for State Legislatures summarizes different policies across all the states. Some require photo ID, some don't. All right, absentee ballots and the ballots for pre-identity verification voters at the polls are supposed to be tracked as provisional ballots. They are supposed to be counted with other ballots only once the voter's identity has been verified. As previously mentioned, this verification is impossible after the stub with the ballot number has been separated from the ballot. Now, in addition to controlling the state of each critical artifact, it is also important to track the transfer of information between artifacts. For example, a single ballot might be run through a voting machine multiple times, or the flash drive containing a precinct vote tally may take a detour to another computer before it is sealed in the precinct vote tally envelope. Or the vote tally envelope itself might be tampered with during transfer between a polling location and the clerk's office. Security during the transfer of data is equally important as securing the integrity of individual election artifacts such as poll books and ballots. And even if poll workers are very diligent in their following of security protocols, precinct-level vote tallies pass through many different hands, which brings me to an old adage often attributed to Joseph Stalin. Those who vote decide nothing. Those who count the vote decide everything. On what is a completely unrelated side note, Stalin won all of his elections for chairman of the Council of Ministers until the day he died. It is for this reason that the transfer of data between artifacts must be treated with scrutiny equal to that applied to each of the artifacts themselves. This oversight is often referred to as the maintenance of a chain of custody. Let's look at a few ways data is transferred. Upon precinct closure, the secured artifacts such as ballots, poll books, and voting machines are often transferred to the clerk's office in a vehicle. This vehicle is supposed to be occupied by representatives of both political parties. The chain of custody must be verified during this transfer. Some precincts use local wireless networks to connect voting machines to a central tabulator. All it takes is the ability to access one device on this network in order to control all the devices on the network. Now, even if none of these machines are connected to the internet, wireless networks can be easily hacked by nearby individuals with the appropriate electronic gadgets, thereby putting the integrity of the tabulated results for that particular precinct at risk. Now, connecting to any single device on that network to the internet also expands the vulnerability beyond the range of wireless router signal to anywhere in the world. Our increasing dependence upon electronics to conduct our elections opens the door to sophisticated fraud schemes, which are often undetectable. Now, during my tenure in the Michigan Senate, I discovered the existence of something called the sales tax suppression system, often referred to as a zapper. Zappers were electronic devices installed in cash registers to adjust the amounts of cash transactions downward so that the vendor would not be liable for as much sales tax. This system was used by a local restaurant chain to funnel $20 million to Hezbollah, a terrorist organization. It is conceivable that this same technology could be applied to voting machines to suppress specific votes. All it takes is a USB flash drive configured with the Zapper software. Sophisticated electronics are not necessary to commit voter fraud. In fact, one of the largest voter fraud cases in history involves the theft of 100,000 votes in Chicago. It resulted in 63 individuals being convicted of federal election crimes. Still think voter fraud is rare? Well, let's take a look at some undercover footage of the commissioner of the Board of Elections of another big city, New York, for some additional insights.
I guess people don't realize certain neighborhoods in particular, they bus people around to vote.
Oh, like minority neighborhoods, like black neighborhoods and Hispanic neighborhoods?
Chinese too.
Oh. Why do they do that? Just to get like more votes for Democrats or?
More votes for themselves. Or running for office. Your vote gets discounted because they come in with a burger on it and you can vote. People think, it's just a liberal thing to do. But I take my vote seriously. And I don't want other people coming in negating my vote by voting for the other candidate, but they're not even registered voters.
Well, maybe you won't vote for Hillary. I don't know.
I would, but I have no choice.
Well, that video you just witnessed was the New York City Democrat Board of Election Commissioner admitting to systemic voter fraud. Voters are bussed from one polling station to another to vote multiple times. That's what you just saw. Here is what the commissioner had to say about voter ID laws in New York State. Roll that tape.
Well, New York doesn't have voter ID laws, right? New York?
You can't, you're not able to.
Wait, what?
They can't ask for voter ID.
What's that? You can't.
The law. That means you can't ask for voter ID. Which they really should be able to do. You know, I don't think it's too much to ask somebody to show some kind of ID.
Yeah. I mean, why not? I mean, you have to show an ID for everything else.
Right, you go into the building, you got to show your ID.
Well, you're the commissioner, you said, of the Democratic Election Commissioner. So if you think there's voter fraud and you think there should be voter ID, why don't people listen to you? I mean,
Well, that's what the New York State Legislature makes the laws. I don't think the law.
and you think there's a lot of absentee ballots for us, too.
Thousands of absentee ballots. I know where they came from.
Yeah, but that's the thing. Like, Hillary Clinton doesn't support voter ID laws. Like,
I know. That's why I'm not always crazy about everything the Democrats do either.
That was a head election official for the city of New York City. Almost 9 million people live in his jurisdiction. What impact could 9 million fraudulent votes have on a national election? Let's look deeper into the security of voting machines. Remember how I advised against Wi-Fi networks even when not connected to the internet? Well, here's why.
Seema, as midterm elections approach here, election security is front and center here at Black Hat. Election security expert Karsten Sherman walked us through just how vulnerable our voting machines can be. So, Karsten, walk me through how we're going to hack a win-vote machine.
The first thing we're going to do is we connect wirelessly to this machine, and so when we press join, now we are connected to the machine.
That's it?
That's it. What we learned from this is do not use wireless access points on voting machines. Just don't do it. And if you doubt that this is actually the win-vote machine, we can just look and list the directory, and here you see there's a directory called winvote, and so we can also go into this directory, winvote. I'm just going to press demo, and then I will have control.
And now you've successfully broken into the
I
machine.
have broken
And
into.
you could actually, at this point, you would actually have access to the voter database.
Yes.
Which means you would be able, in theory, to change the votes.
That's correct.
Okay, what happens when you open your election information network up to the internet? Let's find out.
We're loving this one, but most people probably wouldn't.
A room full of hackers, all trying to hack into voting machines.
You can possibly make it accept a fake card or accept any card, so you could add your own votes.
These are supposed to be the latest machines. They're still used in elections, and they're running ancient software. I think that, like, if somebody wanted to, it would be pretty easy to fake an election.
Less than a couple hours with access, and they're already figuring out ways to break in and play pranks. But it gets more serious.
So you could leave the security key into it and still inject.
I feel like I'm the only one here that hasn't found a vulnerability. It's not what you think. They've all been invited here to demonstrate just how vulnerable the tech we rely on for our elections can be. The experiment is the brainchild of Jake Braun. He's a former security advisor for the Obama administration.
You know, with everything that happened in 16, what we're trying to do is get this industry to mature from a cybersecurity perspective, so you don't have folks saying what they are now, which is things like machines are unhackable or databases are air-gapped and can't be changed.
It's not clear if any actual machines were infiltrated in the 2016 election, and no one has suggested any physical votes were changed. But intelligence officials agreed that Russia was able to meddle with other election-related systems. This inspired Braun and the organizers of this year's DEF CON hacking conference to collect over 30 pieces of voting-related equipment, including voting machines and a mock elections office, and tell a group of hackers to try any means necessary to break into and reverse engineer them. And it didn't take long. Several were compromised within the first hour and a half.
So if you're a voter in America, we're likely hacking the machine that you vote on. There's a few dozen of these machines and also electronic poll books. In some states, people check in on an electronic device as opposed to a paper book.
How you cast your vote varies from district to district. Some places use this machine, some places use that one. Some counties only vote on paper ballots, but almost all of these machines are still in use somewhere in the United States. Some of the hacks might not work if your district has updated the software on the machines, although many don't.
We can go in and hack this lock within 10 seconds. You gain access to the operating system. We can actually remove this and clone this particular USB. We can go back and start looking at and reverse engineering what's on this image and determining the various ways that we can impact this particular operating system.
When people are going after
You guys, no one will believe you.
if they see XP, they're very happy.
Yeah, good lord. Did he just say good lord? I like it every time it reboots to Windows XP, you hear people groaning behind that. The machines you use to cast your vote aren't the only point of entry for attackers. Other election-related systems, like campaign networks and registration databases, are also at risk.
The vulnerabilities at the voting machine level are very localized, and what we're trying to simulate out here is the entire back-end network.
There's a lot of mischief these guys can do without ever actually having to physically get access to a machine. If they were just to go in and mess up the voter file, you could have millions of people showing up at the wrong precinct, or showing up at the right precinct, but the name's wrong in the poll book, and then all of a sudden, now they don't know where they need to go.
Intelligence officials have stated that Russia was able to influence the election without the need to penetrate actual voting machines by breaching DNC computers, accessing staffer emails and opposition research. The Department of Homeland Security also found that they targeted election-related systems in as many as 21 states.
If you wanted to go in and specifically manipulate vote counts on every single machine in America, that'd be really hard to do.
Right.
But you don't need to do that to have an impact on the election in 18 either. You only have to flip a couple Senate seats to have an impact on U.S. Congress.
Clearly, we've got a lot to consider. All right, we've addressed the most critical vulnerabilities within our election processes. Now let's take a look upstream of the election. Let's look at how influence operations before votes are cast influence the outcomes of elections. How do influence operations shape the opinions of voters about a given candidate or ballot proposal? This is a summary of the primary tools available to influence operators. Funding is first and foremost on the list for a reason. It enables all the other tools on this list. It is for this reason that campaign finance information is often seen as a means of improving transparency around influence operations. In any political campaign, the bulk of expenses typically goes towards advertising. TV ads, in particular, are quite expensive and often most influential. Events can also be quite expensive to stage. Everything from venue rental, security services, and keynote speakers do not often come cheap. Sometimes events are staged with minimal expense to generate what is called earned media, which is a fancy term for doing something so outrageous that the media will take notice of you even if they previously didn't give you the time of day. Another tool is that of censorship. If you can subject the electorate to only one side of a political narrative, you have a much better chance of getting support for your views by the electorate. Which leads to another powerful tool of influence operations, that of bias. As one who served in elected office for 8 years prior to running for governor, I would often be amazed when I read the newspaper accounts of events that I attended. It often left me wondering if I truly attended the same event that they had attended. I came to the conclusion that most news stories are written before anybody is interviewed. The interviews simply fill in the blanks with a few quotes. I refer to this as Mad Lib journalism, harkening back to the word puzzles by the same name that I used to complete for fun as a kid. Not so much fun anymore. Bias is a very powerful tool used by influence operators for swaying opinions. Now, another way to influence elections is by wearing out your shoe leather or dialing your fingers off with good old-fashioned direct voter contact. One-on-one conversations or outreach are surefire ways of shaping the opinion of voters. Now, all the aforementioned influence tools can be used lawfully, unethically, or unlawfully. Which category a given activity falls into is typically a function of intent and governing statute. First, let's take a look at some examples of lawful influence operations. The most obvious form of a lawful influence operation is product marketing. The cost of a 30-second spot during the Super Bowl can be over $5 million, so this is significant cost. The goal, of course, is to get consumers to buy the pertinent product. When it comes to elections, the product is the candidate. Candidate committees are formed with the express purpose of electing somebody to office. Political parties and issue advocacy organizations often also seek to influence voters regarding broader issues of public policy and specific candidates. Movies, TV shows, and musicians are perhaps today's most significant influencers of culture and voter attitudes, and they can be pushing for candidates as well. One could also make the case that while there are exceptions, these forms of influence operations are indeed lawful. Now, examples of some unlawful influence operations are those which seek to undermine our system of government. Examples of such operators are foreign governments and domestic organizations who advocate for the overthrow of our government. These domestic organizations often do so with the assistance of foreign operators. Now, in between the extreme of lawful and unlawful influence operations are those which fall into a gray area that, for the sake of discussion, I'm going to classify simply as unethical. Organizations with this classification sometimes take advantage of special legal privileges granted to them so as to influence people in unethical ways. Let's take a deeper look at examples of lawful influence campaigns that pertain to elections. Get out the vote campaigns are examples of lawful influence campaigns. Examples of such get out the vote campaigns include the following: motor voter laws, where one is automatically registered to vote when they apply for their driver's license, for example. We've also got Rock the Vote campaigns. Rock the Vote is a successful initiative promoted within our schools to encourage young voters to vote. Vote Forward is a modern take on a time-old tradition of encouraging citizens to vote via handwritten notes. Additional ways to increase the number of people who vote are initiatives that would lower the voting age or even allow felons to vote. Campaign contributions are among the most heavily regulated form of influence activity. Most forms of contributions are limited. Early voting campaigns are forms of influence operations that seek to lock in votes as soon as possible during an election. By locking votes in early, candidates can insulate themselves from voters who might otherwise reconsider their vote if they were exposed to additional information. Furthermore, those with access to early voting data can use that data to target specific voting precincts for get-out-the-vote activities. No reason absentee voting is another, more subtle way of influencing votes. Voters within a given voting block can be coerced in their votes via what unions refer to as card check tactics. Many people confuse absentee voting with mail-in voting initiatives. They're not the same thing. Mail-in voting is initiated by the Secretary of State, who mails a ballot to every voter in the voter registration database. Since 20% of the voters in a typical voter registration database are invalid due to deaths or changes of address, unused ballots can stack up at a point of delivery and be harvested by people willing to vote early and vote often. Absentee voting is initiated by the voter, so the 20% error rate in the voter registration database is of no direct consequence in absentee voting. Now let's look at the national popular vote movement. Earlier, we established that election laws are primarily the domain of state governments. Sometimes the policy of a given state, though, can be at odds with the policies of other states, particularly when it comes to the degree by which the integrity of the vote is secured. The Electoral College was established by our founding fathers as a firewall of sorts against insecure voting practices. The Electoral College effectively isolates the results of an insecure election to a single state, rather than infecting the results of all the other states, thereby limiting the impact of such integrity issues in a nationwide election. If we were to remove the protective firewall of the Electoral College from our presidential elections, a handful of states with lax election integrity could decide who is our president, as is conveyed in this graphic posted by the Daily Kos. Okay, we've looked at various lawful, albeit not necessarily prudent, influence operations. Now let's take a look at some unethical operations. Now, according to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Section 702 is a key provision of FISA Amendments Act of 2008 that permits the government to conduct targeted surveillance of foreign persons located outside the United States with the compelled assistance of electronic communication service providers to acquire foreign intelligence information. The government uses this information collected under Section 702 to protect the United States and its allies from hostile foreign adversaries, including terrorists, proliferators, and spies, and to inform cybersecurity efforts. The government cannot use Section 702 to target U.S. persons or persons located in the U.S. However, as Congress understood when it passed the statute, it is possible that a foreign person who has been targeted under Section 702 may communicate with or discuss information concerning a U.S. person. Whether or not the government is expressly prohibited from targeting U.S. citizens, the fact remains that Section 702 enables a powerful domestic surveillance platform that could be used by government officials to do just that in an unethical manner. The U.S. government is not the only organization with access to the data collected under Section 702. Government contractors have access to that information as well. There is even evidence to suggest that this information is analyzed and stored in foreign countries.
My focus was primarily in the development on a couple different contracts for the Department of Defense for the development of the capabilities for interactive internet activities, being something that helps support CNO, which is computer network operations, hacking and different things like that, and information operations, which would be your actual influence operations, right? It's a supporting application that really, it's kind of like a Microsoft project, right? Which allows you to manage large projects, like enterprise level projects, but instead of like managing the building of the construction of a 14-story building, it's managing the most, malevolent operations that you could imagine.
Remember Watergate? The data collected by NSA today makes Watergate look like child's play. Any digital communication can be tapped. Phone communications, text messages, emails, conversations around audio devices like Alexa or Google Home or your smartphone, any digitized communication. Any organization in the possession of such information would have tremendous power to influence elections. Many private companies such as Google, Apple, Facebook, and Twitter have access to information on par with that collected via government surveillance networks. We collectively refer to these companies as big tech. As citizens, we willingly give these companies this power when we hit the I accept button on their legal agreements, acting as gateways to using their services. How can these companies use this information to influence elections? Well, let's see.
The NSA data system collects everything through what's called the upstream, where everything is stored for 72 hours, then dumped. However, if one could twin this stream of data, they could privatize it. Imagine what you could do with that.
We need to understand that big tech has been given special protections from civil liability under Section 230 of the Telecommunications Act. The rationale behind this exemption is that big tech is viewed as a utility. They don't publish content. They simply provide a means of sharing the content. Therefore, they shouldn't be held liable for such content. So when big tech makes biased commentaries on content via things like fact checkers or political censorship, they have strayed into the same domain as the media, which is not immune from libel suits, as recently demonstrated by the successful multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit by Covington Catholic High School student against the Washington Post. So, can big tech bias influence elections? Yes, it can. Here's some information as to exactly how that's done.
I have been center-left my whole adult life, but I value my country and democracy more than I value any party or candidate. That is why I'm speaking out today. I'm here to explain why Google poses a serious threat to democracy, how monitoring systems can protect us from companies like Google, and how Congress can immediately end Google's worldwide monopoly on search. My plan for ending that monopoly was published just yesterday in Business Week, I respectfully request that my article be entered into the congressional record that's attached to my full testimony.
It will be entered without objection.
I've been a research psychologist for nearly 40 years. My PhD is from Harvard, and since 1981 I've published extensively on AI and other topics. Some of my research has focused on Google, on the company's massive surveillance operations, censorship capabilities, and unprecedented ability to manipulate the thinking of 2.5 billion people, soon to be 4+ billion. I've written articles about Google for Time Magazine, USA Today, that kind of thing, but also for the Daily Caller and even Russia's Sputnik News. I reach out to diverse audiences because I believe the threats posed by Google, and to a lesser extent Facebook, are so serious that everyone needs to know about them. Here are just 3 disturbing findings from my research which adheres to the very highest standards of scientific integrity. Number 1, in 2016, Google's search algorithm likely impacted undecided voters in a way that shifted at least 2.6 million votes to Hillary Clinton, whom I supported. I know this because I preserved more than 13,000 election-related searches prior to Election Day, and Google's search results were significantly biased in favor of Secretary Clinton. I know the number of votes that shifted because I've conducted dozens of controlled experiments that measure how opinions shift when search results are biased. I call this shift SEAM, the Search Engine Manipulation Effect, which I first published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2015. Biased search results can easily produce shifts in the opinions and voting preferences of undecided voters by up to 80% in some demographic groups because people blindly trust high-ranking search results over lower ones. SEAM is an especially dangerous form of influence because it is in effect subliminal. It also leaves no paper trail for authorities to trace. It's an example of a short-lived or, quote, ephemeral experience. That's a phrase you'll find in internal emails that have leaked recently from Google. I'm now studying 7 such manipulations like SEAM, and unlike billboards or those Russian-placed ads, these manipulations are invisible and non-competitive. They're controlled entirely by big tech companies, and there is no way to counteract them. Number 2, on Election Day in 2018, the Go Vote reminder that Google displayed on its homepage gave one political party at least 800,000 more votes than it gave the other party. That reminder was not a public service, it was a vote manipulation. Number 3, in the weeks leading up to the 2018 election, bias in Google search results may have shifted upwards of 78.2 million votes spread across many races to the candidates of one political party.
The power of big tech goes well beyond bias, though. Many times it's its outright censorship of views which they oppose. If big tech is able to silence the voice of the President of the United States without consequence, do you think they will even hesitate to silence your views? This censorship results in a further polarization of our society, as only one worldview is allowed to be propagated. The polarization of America correlates with the polarization of our information sources. Unfortunately, journalism has been replaced by political advocacy on both sides of the political spectrum. Our media has been granted a constitutional right to freedom of the press. There are numerous examples of that freedom being used in unethical manners to push political agendas on both sides of the political spectrum. Here's just one example.
On March 30th, Car Show aired what looked to be a pretty routine political story featuring Camerata and a panel of 6 Trump voters.
So here we are, 60 plus days into his presidency, and we want to get your grades and your impressions of how President Trump is doing.
The raw audio of the panel interview was leaked to us. It lasted nearly an hour and a half, cut down to only 8 minutes when it aired. What's striking is not what Carr and his fellow producers chose to include, but what they chose to omit. It's called selective editing. Let's look at this portion, when panelist William Baer is discussing the president's claim of voter fraud.
And we don't know how, as far as the votes and fraud and everything else. I mean, my assumption is that he probably would have gotten elected by a higher number than what the results actually showed.
But are you saying that you believe that there were 3 to 5 million illegals who voted?
Oh, well, I know that in New Hampshire. I've seen it. I've seen busloads of people.
This is what we keep coming back to. When you say you've seen it, do you mean a dozen? Or do you mean 3 million? There's a difference.
Well, obviously, there's only 1.5 million people in New Hampshire, so I didn't say 3 million people.
Well, the number that President Trump said was 3 to 5 million illegals.
I don't doubt that.
No, he said in California.
Extrapolating based on what I've seen with my own eyes, busloads of people coming in, whether they're illegal, meaning they came into the country illegally, or they're illegal voters, they came over from Massachusetts into New Hampshire.
Billy, are you sticking with that you've seen busloads or no?
I have seen busloads. I guess I can't cite the busloads that I've seen and where I've seen them, but on television I've seen it.
Baer is painted as a conspiracy theorist. Look at the on-screen chyron. Quote, Trump voters on his unproven voter fraud claims, unquote. The implication, no evidence of voter fraud whatsoever. When Camerata asks for proof, the panelist has no answer. Or so it seems. Here's the raw audio from immediately after the edit.
I have seen busloads. I guess I can't cite the busloads that I've seen and where I've seen them, but on television I've seen it. And I mean, has anybody looked into like what James O'Keefe has done when he went undercover to these various polling places? I know, but he went in and basically was ready to vote as somebody else. Nobody asked for ID. I was actually a poll watcher in New Jersey, and I saw what was going on there. There were college students voting, and there was basically, you use that's right, or you use a provisional ballot, and it's never challenged. They just put it right through. This is common.
At the moment Baer is about to cite the evidence to support his claim, CNN ends the clip. The piece suggests that Baer did not have a legitimate answer to Camerata's question. In actuality, the answer was cut because it didn't fit their narrative. This is a textbook lie of omission.
When you look at some of these Project Veritas undercover reports around voter fraud, what's really striking is how cavalier the poll workers were about these blatant attempts to steal the vote. That's what's most concerning. Now, when I ran for governor, news reports, particularly TV and radio news reports, routinely mentioned 2 of my competitors while omitting my name altogether. Mind you, I was not some fringe candidate. I was a 2-term state senator from the most populous county in the state. I was the first candidate to collect over 15,000 signatures to get on the ballot, and did so with a volunteer army while other campaigns resorted to paid signature gatherers. I would consistently receive over 75% of the vote at straw polls conducted at events all across the state. I participated in 13 debates with other candidates, including 3 televised debates. At the time of voting, however, only 15% of voters knew who I was. Despite this disadvantage, I still earned 13% of the vote. Now, if I didn't realize how powerful media bias and censorship was before my campaign for governor, I can tell you I truly do now. One of the biggest expenses for any campaign is advertising. What happens if the media is overwhelmingly biased in favor of one candidate over the other? They are in essence advertising for their favorite candidate. In donation parlance, this equates to a gift in kind. Is this donation tracked? No, but it undoubtedly influences the attitudes of voters. Advocates of limits on campaign financing or improved donation transparency never seem to address the very real issue of media bias in political campaigns. Even if such advocates were to address the political bias within the media, it would be very difficult to track the financial impact of such in-kind contributions. Another example of unethical influence operations is that of lawfare. Rather than promoting the merit of a policy position or a candidate, lawfare typically features a barrage of lawsuits. The lawsuits become the news stories, not the policy or the candidate. Even if unsuccessful with the legal action, lawfare is often successful at subduing interest in a topic or candidate by the voters. This tactic is often used by those who have weak candidates with significant financial resources against stronger candidates with limited financial resources. What are some examples of unlawful acts? All right, well, let's start by first looking at United States law related to influence operations. Treason, rebellion, conspiracy, and advocating the overthrow of government are examples of unlawful influence operations. The perpetrators of these operations can be either foreign or domestic agents. The Department of Homeland Security breaks down foreign interference into information activities pertinent to new media abuse, i.e. big tech, and traditional media abuse, i.e. newspapers, TV, and radio. Cyber activities are seen as a mechanism for influencing either of these channels. Now, foreign agents are not the only ones seeking to take down America. There are numerous domestic agents which seek to do so as well. The FBI tracks domestic terrorists, many of which have been prominent in recent riots in cities all across America. Congress has started to take action by drafting resolutions that would designate violent organizations such as Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. Then there are organizations such as the Sunrise Movement, which seek to overthrow our system of government and replace it with one of their own making.
My dream is that we bring these failed and corrupt institutions to their knees and we build something new.
Closer to home on the subject of elections, we have Marxist revolutionary organizations such as the Black Panther Party engaging in what appears to be voter intimidation tactics at the polls.
I have a poll watcher certificate so I can go inside.
I was wondering why you come up taking pictures.
I mean, what?
I just wondering why everybody's taking pictures, that's all.
Okay. I mean, I think it might be a little bit intimidating that you have a stick in your hand. That's why. You know?
Yes. Who are you to decide?
I'm an attorney. I mean, that's a weapon, so that's why I'm a little worried.
Who are you to decide?
I mean, I am a concerned citizen, and I'm just worried that you might be...
So are we.
Okay.
That's why we're here.
Okay, but you have a nightstick in your hand. I mean...
You got a camera phone.
I have a camera phone, which is not a weapon.
If we are to protect the integrity of our elections, we must also protect the ability of citizens to vote, and do so without fear of any intimidation or unlawful deception. It's time to define our objectives regarding election integrity. So let's start by breaking these objectives into three basic categories: before one casts a vote, after one casts a vote, and enforcement should that be necessary. Now, before one casts a vote, I believe that most people would agree that we need to encourage everyone who is eligible to vote to vote. Pretty straightforward. Voting isn't just simply a right, it's a duty, it's a responsibility. We also need to ensure that each citizen is only able to vote once per election. We need to ensure that the person who completes the ballot is actually the person registered to complete the ballot. And we need to ensure that only citizens are allowed to vote. We also should be promoting civics awareness so people better understand the issues they're voting on. And we need to secure the electorate from influence operations. Now, after one casts a vote, we need to ensure that every vote is counted. Poll voters, absentee voters, including deployed military. We also need to ensure that every vote is only cast once. And we need to ensure that each vote cast is secured in a manner that supports a high integrity recount. When it comes to enforcement, we need to systematically investigate precinct by precinct voting irregularities. We need to implement and monitor effective corrective action plans for incidents of negligence. We can't keep doing this year after year without any correction. Now, where there is election fraud, we also need to pursue criminal prosecutions. There you have it. You may have additional objectives or a revised list altogether. That's fine, but Build 1.0 of our election integrity solution would be based on these objectives. If you'd like to evaluate a different set of objectives, please share your recommendations in the comment section of this post. I would submit that all these objectives are equally important. When we evaluate all potential election integrity solutions, all of these objectives will have the same weight factor applied when calculating the final score for each solution. So let's delve into solutions, shall we? All right, it's time to identify some solutions that could be implemented to ensure the integrity of our elections. And let's start by dividing these solutions into solutions that citizens can implement and those that government can implement. All right, let's start off by taking a look at potential citizen solutions. Number one, you can vote. If you don't vote, elected officials won't take your voice seriously. Matter of fact, the fewer people who vote, the easier it is for elected officials to focus upon getting their favorite constituency to vote and ignore your voice altogether. Another solution is that you can register voters. Wouldn't it be nice if 100% of us took our right and responsibility to vote seriously? Elected officials would not be able to take any of their constituents for granted if that were the case. Next, a solid way to ensure that our election processes are not subverted is to work at the polls yourself as a poll worker. Most clerks are desperate to find people committed to working at the polls in order to ensure fair elections. Next, you can volunteer to be a poll watcher or serve as a poll challenger representing an organization dedicated to preserving the integrity of our vote. All right, I talked about 3 different roles here: poll workers, poll watchers, and poll challengers. Let's talk about what each one of those does so we can differentiate them a little bit. First of all, what does a poll worker do? Poll worker executes the precinct day, election day operations. They verify the voter identity. They distribute the ballots. They secure the ballots after votes have been cast. They verify the vote tally. They are indeed compensated for their work. What's a poll watcher do? Well, first, this is a volunteer activity, and the specific duties vary from state to state, but in general, they do the following. They watch early voting polling place activities. They watch election day polling place activities. They watch early voting ballot board meeting activities. They watch over central counting stations. They watch over voters being assisted by an election official. They inspect and secure the voting equipment. They oversee delivery of election results and observe signature verification committees, and they review defective applications. You got to have a pretty good understanding of the election process we were talking about to be a good poll watcher. So what's involved with serving as a poll challenger? Very similar to poll watcher, but essentially they break out like this. You observe. You observe the election process in voting precincts and absentee voter counting board precincts. You can challenge voters. You can challenge a person's right to vote if the challenger has good reason, very good reason, to believe that that person is not eligible to vote in that precinct. Also, you can challenge inspectors. You can challenge the actions of election inspectors serving in the precinct if the challenger believes that election law is not being followed. Now, another solution is that citizens can do is that if you don't have an election integrity organization in your state, form one. Forming an election integrity organization like a 501c4 enables you to do the following. You can put out communications regarding the election, highlighting what the day is of the election, what are all the different polling places, that kind of stuff, or where they can find out where they're registered to vote, or even if they are registered to vote. That you can develop election quality scorecards. You can develop voter registration database scorecards and keep all the folks in government on their game. You can issue FOIA requests to verify election processes and results. You can file lawsuits as required. You can recruit poll challengers, and you can make lifelong friendships with your clerk by recruiting poll workers. All right, maybe you're not too much into organizing things. No problem. You still have another solution you can pursue. You can still focus upon letting your voice be heard, and in the following ways. First of all, get informed on the issue. But once you're informed on the issues, be active on social media. Attend election board meetings. Write letters to the editor. Call into radio shows. And lastly, as a citizen, you can engage even more directly in our body politic by running for office yourself. Yeah, that's one of the solutions. Take it from me, there is no better way to get a deep appreciation for the election process and the need to preserve its integrity than by running for office yourself. All right, now, what solutions can those who serve us in government implement? Number one, we need to prosecute any violations of the law. In the wake of the 2016 presidential election, Green Party candidate Jill Stein challenged the election results in Michigan and demanded a recount. The recount identified quite a few voting irregularities that demanded further investigation. One such irregularity was a precinct with a poll book stating that there were 306 votes cast, yet the voting machine only contained 50 ballots. It's not clear whether or not a poll worker found a ballot he or she liked and ran it through 256 times. As a state senator, I sent a letter to Attorney General Bill Schuette and CC'd Secretary of State Ruth Johnson. Secretary Johnson performed an analysis of the votes and identified at least 31 counts of voter fraud. You may have noticed that I said at least 31 counts. There might have been more, but 33 voting jurisdictions refused to provide any information to support such an analysis. The Secretary of State shared this information with the Attorney General. What happened? Nothing. There were 0 prosecutions for voter fraud, and the 33 jurisdictions which failed to provide the requested information were never held accountable for their dismissal of the investigation by the Secretary of State. How can we preserve the integrity of our elections if we fail to prosecute violations of the law? Next, we need to create an online dashboard to monitor the quality of the voter registration database. What else can we do? Well, we can require poll voters to show a voter ID, preferably a photo ID. Some people attempt to paint this as a means of suppressing the vote, but no one claims that showing a photo ID at the airport before boarding a plane suppresses air travel. Another way to protect the integrity of our elections is to provide 24/7 monitoring of all critical components of the election system. This approach is already taken in countries that have struggled with election integrity, such as Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Sierra Leone, Colombia, and Albania. Opening this monitoring up to third-party watchdog organizations would help as well. And whenever there is an indication of malfeasance from these cameras, it's important that we send in a quick response team immediately with law enforcement and lawyers. Now, in this digital age, it's also still important from a solution perspective to provide a printed verification of all electronic tallies to support any recount reconciliation efforts. Another solution is to simply train poll workers. That's very important. Simple ideas such as the need to separate provisional ballots from verified ballots are among the key concepts that are important to reinforce via training. Another way to protect election integrity is to establish foolproof voter eligibility verification procedures. Now, in order to maintain an accurate voter registration database, we can also establish voter list maintenance cooperation agreements with other states. It takes care of when people move in and out of states. We go off and get automatic updates. We can also help isolate the influence of big tech on election outcomes by implementing Dr. Robert Epstein's election monitoring system. In addition to state cooperation agreements, each local jurisdiction should develop and maintain procedures needed to ensure accurate voter rolls. One last solution for government to implement would be for our federal government to remove Section 230 protections for big tech in context of their predisposition to assume the role of content publisher when they censor political content posted by their users. That's it. That's all the solutions which I have proposed for Build 1.0 of our Election Integrity Solutions podcast. You may have additional solutions that you'd like to propose. I'd love to hear about them. If you want to share those, please do so in the comments section or via our solutions page at letsfixstuff.org. Now it's time to identify which of these solutions best satisfy the objectives that we established earlier. Now, when we score each one of our solutions against the objectives that we established earlier, training poll workers actually rises to the top as the highest priority solution to pursue. Registering voters, while still having a positive influence on election integrity, scored last against our objectives. Overall, the top 3 solutions identified are: number 1, training poll workers; number 2, serving as a poll challenger; and number 3, serving as a poll worker. The top 3 solutions specific to citizens are serving as a poll challenger, serving as a poll worker, and forming an election integrity organization. The top 3 solutions specific to government are training poll workers, prosecuting violations of the law, and 24/7 monitoring of critical components of the election system. There you have it. If you want to fix election integrity, we've given you a good place to start with these solutions. We put a lot of work in election integrity research and the production of this video. Let us know how we did, and please be kind in regards to my dialogue at times. Remember, I'm an engineer. Please like and subscribe so that you'll receive notifications of future solution podcasts. Now, if you'd like to download our footnotes and analysis spreadsheet for this podcast, please visit letsfixstuff.org. Right Stuff members are allowed to go off and download these materials for free. If you're already a member of the Right Stuff Club, thank you so much for your support. You make this pursuit of rational, data-driven, agendaless policy solutions possible. Now, let's share how we can fix election integrity with our friends, family, and elected officials.